I thought retirement would mean fewer surprises. I was wrong. There's a certain hush that comes with getting older, a quiet that settles into the house like dust. But some quiets are only waiting rooms for the past, and I have spent a life walking through those waiting rooms. On a damp morning in Ashford, the kind where the fog clings to the hedgerows and the postman's steps sound softer than they should, I was alone with a stack of boxes I brought home the day I left the hospital. They were mine to keep, they said, personal copies, for memory, for records. Mostly, they were the small things that make up a lifetime of work. Intake forms, lab results, folded sheets of notes written in the margins of the real stories. I wasn't looking for anything, but one folder insisted on being found. The tag was brittle at the corner. Patient 0437. Daniel Whitmore. Date of death: August 14, 2005. Cause: cardiac arrest. Performed by Dr. Edward Marlowe. My name printed in my own hurried hand. My mind supplied the scene as if it came from a different room. Fluorescent lights, the hush of a nurse removing gloves, the soft, final sound when a monitor goes flat. I had closed that evening more than once in my head. I opened the file. A photograph fell into my palm. A man in his 40s with a narrow face, dark hair thinning on the crown, a small crescent scar beneath the left jaw. The report was clinical, almost bored in its thoroughness. The usual sections: time, observations, tissue samples collected, toxicology pending. But my eyes snagged on something near the bottom of the page. A faint red smudge, like a thumbprint pressed into paper and left to dry there, as if someone had been in a hurry to sign without wiping the ink. I turned the page, then another. Handwritten notes in my own script. I read each line slowly, like tracing the contour of a memory. And then I did what curiosity, that incurable patient of mine, always makes me do. I logged into the hospital database. The hospital's system had changed a dozen times since I'd retired. New software, new security protocols, retina scans and fingerprint locks that made it almost arrogant how thoroughly modern medicine had learned to guard itself. I typed the patient number. The screen loaded. The name came up. Daniel Whitmore. At first I thought it was a coincidence. A namesake, a son, or an unrelated citizen with the same unlucky combination of letters on his birth certificate. I told myself that. I wanted to believe it. But the entry read, admitted, yesterday. Room 213B. Same social security number. Same date of birth. Same fingerprint ID. My hands went cold. 20 years is a long time. People die. Paper files fade. I had signed that autopsy report. I had written the words, cause of death, cardiac arrest, in a handwriting that still felt like my own even when it trembled. I had closed the file. And yet, the system insisted the patient was active. That the man whose life I had catalogued as finished was in a hospital bed within the same walls where I once worked. I left the house before my coffee had gone cold. Driving to Ashford Memorial felt, absurdly, like going home. The town had not changed much, the same bookstore on the corner, the same rusted lamppost by the square. But the hospital's new wing glinted under a low sun, glass and plastic, efficient and unyielding. Inside, the scent was the same: antiseptic, cheap soap, paper, a faint sweetness of disinfectant that always made my throat tighten. Room 213B was down a corridor that seemed longer than I remembered. Footsteps echoed like a metronome. When I reached the door, there was a small window set into the wood. The nurse at the station looked up when I signed in, recognition and a trace of alarm on her face. "Dr. Marlowe," she said, "you shouldn't be here. You should see it yourself." I pressed my palm against the cool glass and looked in. A man lay under a thin blanket, pale in the clinical light, an IV line in his arm. A monitor beeped a steady, ordinary rhythm. He breathed steadily, not the ragged, gasping breaths you see in emergency wards, just the plain, unremarkable sound of lungs doing what lungs do. His face turned toward the door as if he had sensed my presence. The scar cut like a line of light beneath his jaw. It could have been any stranger. I kept telling myself that. I wanted it to be a stranger. But there was the photograph, perched in my memory like a nail driven home. The angle of the cheekbone. The set of the mouth. The eyes, narrow and watchful, never quite soft. I felt a foolish urge to reach for the file in my coat pocket. Old habits. The nurse noticed me hesitate and stepped to the door. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, We're just monitoring him. He hasn't woken for a while. He's stable. Stable. The language of medicine is a polite disguise. Stable meant not dying at the moment the report was written. Stable meant the charts did not yet demand an autopsy. Stable meant time. I watched him. This man I had declared dead 2 decades earlier, breathing, alive, in a bed 2 corridors away from where I had cried a quiet, private grief and closed a folder I thought I had put to rest. Outside the room, the hum of the hospital continued. A cart clattered. Someone laughed in a staff area, a thin sound. The world kept going in its ordinary way. Inside me, a different clock began ticking. Not a mechanical timepiece, but something older, the slow, insistent metronome of doubt. If this man was indeed Daniel Whitmore, then the life I thought I had catalogued and closed might be an incomplete story, and if a story is incomplete, it demands an ending. Or perhaps it demands a different kind of truth. I left the hospital that afternoon with the file tucked under my arm and a temperature that had nothing to do with fever. The red smudge in the paperwork burned in my mind like a brand. Over and over, I tried to place it. A fingerprint, a crease in a page, a memory of a hand that shouldn't have been there. On the drive home, the sky darkened and rain began to drape the road in silver threads. I told myself to wait, to let the facts assemble like patients coming into observation, calmly, clinically. But patience has never been my most reliable virtue. At the kitchen table that night, I spread the old file open. I ran my finger along the margin notes and stopped at an abbreviation I had written in haste all those years ago. Anomalous presentation. I had signed off on the report. I had signed the death certificate. But the little note, a scribble intended for my younger self, remained like an accusation. When you spend your life with death, you learn the small language of the margins. The words you write when you are not sure, the coffee stains that cross a sentence, the underlined phrase you meant to investigate. They become a geography of doubt. That night, Ashford slept under a blanket of rain. I didn't. I lay awake and listened for the sound of a monitor that had long since stopped for one man and had somehow started, inexplicably, for another. Some files close quietly, with the acceptance of time. Others wait. They wait until someone opens them again. And when they're opened, they tend to ask questions that won't let you sleep. Sleep, that night, was like trying to rest under a flickering light, brief, uncertain, and full of shadows. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that room again. The sound of the heart monitor wasn't just a beep anymore. It had rhythm, almost like a whisper. A whisper that somehow said my name. By dawn, I'd given up on sleep entirely. The kettle hissed, the house creaked, and the same thought echoed. What if the body wasn't the mystery, but the record itself? I had kept meticulous records throughout my career. Dates, signatures, serials, every detail mattered. Mistakes could mean death. But the Whitmore file was clean. Too clean. The kind of cleanliness that hides fingerprints, not removes them. Around 8 a.m., I returned to the hospital. Technically, I had no authority there anymore. But there's a certain reverence given to the retired, like ghosts who still walk familiar halls. People nod, but don't question. I went straight to the archives. New building, new codes. Still, the same sterile hum of fluorescent lights. The clerk behind the counter didn't even glance up when I asked for the 213B records. Systems offline, he muttered. Routine maintenance. I almost laughed. That's what they used to say whenever something shouldn't be found. But there was another way. The old files, before the digital migration, were stored in the sub-basement. No one ever touched them. No one except me. The air grew colder as I descended the narrow stairwell. My footsteps echoed on concrete. Somewhere above, a pipe hissed, like something exhaling. The sub-basement looked exactly as I remembered, rows of metal cabinets, gray with dust and time. The smell of paper rot and disinfectant. It was strange how easily my hands remembered the order of things, and there it was. Drawer 4C. Patient 0437 Whitmore, Daniel. Except this time, there were 2 folders. One dated 2005. One dated 2025. My pulse quickened. I opened the newer file. The format was familiar, but the handwriting wasn't mine. A neat, precise style. And on the first page, case overseen by Dr. E. Marlowe. I froze. Same name. Same initial. Even the same signature, only steadier, as if written by a younger hand. Impossible. The report was detailed. Vital signs stable, cardiac rhythm normal, minor arrhythmia observed. Photograph attached. It was Daniel Whitmore, no doubt. But younger, healthier. I stared at the signature again, tracing the ink with my fingertip. Identical loops, identical slant. It was my handwriting. But I had never written it. A faint sound came from behind me, metal scraping against metal. I turned, flashlight trembling in my grip. One of the drawers had slid open by itself. Inside were more files, each one marked with a patient number, each one labeled, deceased. And on every single one, a red mark, not ink this time, but something darker, dried into the paper like old blood. The light flickered. Something moved in the far corner of the room. A shadow, slow, deliberate, human-shaped. I took a step back. The beam caught a reflection. A small medical mirror on the wall. For an instant, I saw my own face, but not as it was. Younger, clean-shaven, eyes sharp, alive, and yet utterly cold. Then the reflection blinked. I dropped the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, slicing through dust and fear alike. When I looked up again, the shadow was gone. Only the drawer remained open, and the second Whitmore file sat waiting, as if inviting me to continue. I took it, closed the cabinet, and left the basement without looking back. That night, as I sat at my desk, the house seemed to breathe with me. The newer file lay beside the old one, two versions of the same story, 20 years apart. And on both, the same signature. I began to write again, documenting what I'd seen. But the words blurred. My hand shook. And when I looked down, the pen was moving faster than I could think, as if someone else were guiding it. By the time I stopped, a single sentence had appeared beneath my notes. You never stopped. Morning came slowly, gray and heavy, like the sky itself was holding its breath. I hadn't really slept, just drifted through hours of stillness, listening to the house expand and contract with the temperature. The files were still on my desk. Two of them, old and new, side by side, like mirrors facing each other, endless reflections feeding into nothing. I hadn't noticed it last night, but the newer file had a faint smell. Not paper, not ink, something metallic, like the scent of an operating room before the first incision. I washed my hands, but the smell stayed. Under my nails, in the lines of my palms. It was as if touching that folder had left a residue, not physical, but deeper. At 9 a.m., I looked into the mirror by the window. I wanted to convince myself I was just tired. That was the rational thing to do. But something about my reflection was wrong. Subtle, but wrong. The eyes, perhaps. They didn't look tired, they looked focused. Alert. Too alert. I leaned closer. There, beneath the surface, I saw it. A faint tremor in the pupils, like a pulse. Not light reflection. A rhythm. Beating. I blinked, and it was gone. But when I looked down, the veins in my hands were more visible than usual, darker, branching like ink beneath parchment. The medical part of my brain started listing possibilities. Circulatory issues, stress, dehydration, early neuropathy. But another part whispered what I refused to consider: contamination. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, then held my breath and stared again. This time, my reflection smiled. I didn't. It was faint. A half-second twitch of the lips, but I saw it. And worse, I felt the muscles in my face not move. I stumbled back, knocking over a glass. The crash broke the silence, and suddenly the air felt thick, almost alive. When I dared to look again, the reflection was normal, expressionless, motionless. I laughed, a sharp, nervous laugh that didn't sound like me. Then I picked up the files and put them away. Out of sight, out of mind. But the mirror by the window. It stayed there, angled just enough to catch my reflection when I wasn't paying attention. Around midnight, I passed by it again. Something made me stop. My reflection wasn't standing where I was. It was closer. It started as a sound I couldn't quite place. Late at night, when the wind was still and the house was silent, I'd hear it, faint, rhythmic, almost human. A slow thump. Thump. Thump, from somewhere beneath the floorboards of my study. At first, I thought it was plumbing. Old pipes have a way of mimicking life, expanding, contracting, clicking in the night. But this was different. It had cadence. It paused when I moved. I stood completely still one evening, listening. 10 seconds of silence. Then, thump, thump. Slower this time, deliberate. I pressed my ear to the floor. The sound was clearer there, deep and hollow, like a heartbeat coming from below. I checked the basement the next morning. The concrete was cold and smooth. No sign of leaks, no cracks, no dripping pipes. Just the old smell of damp dust and forgotten things. But when I stood in the center of the room, directly beneath my study, the air felt heavier. It wasn't temperature. It was pressure. I knelt down, placed my hand flat on the floor, and there it was. A faint vibration, steady, alive. I told myself it was imagination, that my own pulse was echoing through my palm. But when I lifted my hand, the rhythm continued. I recorded it. 30 seconds of that sound. When I played it back, there were layers, multiple rhythms, overlapping, asynchronous. At least 3 distinct pulses. I should have stopped there. I should have sealed the basement, burned the files, and left. But I didn't. That evening, I went back down with my stethoscope. The same one I'd used for 40 years of practice. The diaphragm was cold when I pressed it to the floor. The rhythm came instantly, stronger now. And then, something impossible, a response. The beating changed tempo, matching my own heartbeat. I froze. Then it accelerated. It was following me. I pulled away, stumbled backward, nearly fell. The stethoscope slipped from my hands, the earpieces clattering on the concrete. The sound was gone. I stood there, breathless, heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I realized. The sound hadn't stopped. It had just moved. Now, it was inside me. The first time I realized the house was breathing was during a storm. The rain came hard that night, slashing sideways against the windows like handfuls of nails. The wind moaned through the chimney, a low, guttural sound that reminded me of lungs struggling for air. At 2:17 a.m., I woke to a noise that didn't belong to any storm. It was deep and slow, in, out, in, out. The sound filled the entire room. At first, I thought it was my own breath echoing in the dark. But then the curtains shifted, not with the wind, but with a rhythm, gentle expansions, soft contractions. The air itself was alive. I sat up in bed and felt it, a pulse in the walls. The wallpaper bulged ever so slightly, as if the house itself had lungs beneath the plaster. When I pressed my hand against it, it moved. Barely perceptible, but it moved. I should have panicked. Instead, I listened. Each breath was accompanied by faint creaks in the floorboards, as if the beams and nails were straining under invisible muscles. It was as though the house had taken a long, patient inhale, and was waiting to exhale. Then, something whispered. Not words, just movement. A faint, dragging sound from the hallway outside my room. I turned on the lamp. The light flickered once, twice, and died. The room plunged into darkness again, except for the faint shimmer of lightning through the curtains. The breathing continued, louder now, faster. The ceiling groaned, the windows trembled. And with each thunderclap, the rhythm grew more desperate. I left the bed, stepped carefully toward the hall. The floorboards pulsed under my feet, like veins under skin. At the top of the stairs, I stopped. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. Complete silence. Then, a single, enormous exhale. The lights came back on. Every door in the hallway swung open at once. And in that split second, I swore the walls shrank inward, as if something enormous inside had just finished taking a breath. After that night, the air in the house was never still again. Even on calm days, the curtains would sway, the doors would rattle softly, and the floors would hum like a giant's chest. I've come to accept it now. The house doesn't shelter me anymore. It keeps me alive. Because I think, when it finally stops breathing, so will I. There is a painting that hangs in the main hallway of my home. A tall, rectangular frame that greets me every time I ascend the stairs. It has always been there, as if the house itself was built around it. A man, pale and rigid, dressed in black. His eyes the color of tarnished brass, his mouth caught in that uneasy middle ground between grief and disdain. I never learned his name. There's no signature, no date, not even a brush mark that could betray the hand that painted him. When I first moved in, I didn't pay it much attention. I had other things on my mind, patients, letters, the endless paperwork of retirement. But from the first evening, I noticed something unsettling. Whenever I passed that painting, the air seemed to change. It wasn't a drop in temperature that you could measure with a thermometer. It was a deeper, instinctive cold. The kind that presses into the skin and lingers in the bones. At times, I could almost hear a faint hum in that hallway, like air struggling to move, and though I told myself it was the old pipes, or the wind that slithered through unseen cracks, a small voice inside whispered otherwise. Weeks went by. Then months. The painting became part of the background, and I convinced myself the unease was all in my mind. Until one night, as I sat writing, I heard something, soft, deliberate, like a careful step on an old wooden floor. I turned toward the doorway. The hallway was dark, except for the faint light spilling from my study. And there, half in shadow, was the portrait. I don't mean hanging, I mean present. It felt as though the man in the painting was no longer inside it, but standing just at the edge of my vision, his gaze heavy, pressing. When I looked again, it was exactly as before. Only one detail changed. His head was slightly tilted. Not much, but enough to make it clear. He was now looking directly at me. For a long moment, I sat there frozen. The candle beside me flickered, and in its uneven light, I thought I saw the surface of the painting ripple, the paint shifting, slow as breathing. Then it stopped. Everything was still again. That night, I woke from uneasy dreams to the unmistakable feeling of being watched. My study door was ajar, and through the crack, I saw it, the faintest reflection of eyes. They gleamed faintly, like wet glass catching non-existent light. When I approached, the portrait was silent, lifeless. But the air around it vibrated, as though the canvas itself was listening. Over the following weeks, changes began to appear. At first, subtle. The man's collar seemed looser. Then, more noticeable, the background behind him, once a gentle brown, began to darken to a rich, shadowed black. When I blinked, it sometimes looked moist, like the paint had never truly dried. I attempted to remove it. I lifted it off the wall, heavy with dust and age, and carried it down to the basement. I placed it face down against the concrete floor and covered it with an old sheet. That night, I slept better. But in the morning, the painting was back in the hallway. Perfectly aligned. Perfectly clean. Not a trace of dust on its surface. Something inside me began to unravel. I tried to reason with myself, to explain it as forgetfulness, or the tricks of an old mind growing tired. But deep down, I knew reason no longer had a place here. From then on, the nights grew restless. I would hear the faint sound of footsteps just beyond my room. Sometimes slow and deliberate, sometimes in short, hesitant bursts, like someone pacing, unsure whether to move closer. Once, I caught the faint, chemical scent of turpentine. Another night, the acrid smell of burnt varnish. I stopped turning on the lights. I began to live within the half-dark, where I could pretend nothing had changed. But the painting didn't stop. Every evening, I could feel it. Not see, feel. The weight of a gaze pressing between my shoulder blades, the slow tightening of my throat when I passed the hallway. As though I was the one hanging there now, trapped behind glass, and he, the painted man, was walking free. One stormy night, I decided to confront him. The thunder outside shook the windows, and I stood before the portrait with a candle in hand. The flame wavered, then steadied. The man's face stared back at me, cold, resigned. I whispered something then. I don't remember what. Maybe a plea, or a question. For nearly an hour, I remained there, locked in that silent exchange. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the corridor in a blinding white. And in that instant, I saw it. His eyelids moved. Just once. A blink. The next morning, I barely recognized myself in the mirror. There was a smear on my cheek, dark, oily, the color of dried pigment. It didn't wash away. When I walked past the portrait that day, the man's collar had changed again. It rose slightly higher, hiding his neck. And under the thick, layered paint, something new had begun to take shape. A faint outline of another face. A face that looked almost exactly like mine. I couldn't sleep that night. The ticking of the clock echoed through the old house like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The sound of the wind pressed against the window frames, making them creak as if the entire building was exhaling in pain. Every second stretched longer, heavier, slower, like time itself had begun to notice my fear. I sat at my desk, the dim light of the lamp spilling across piles of paper. Medical files, notes written in the margins, photographs of pale faces and hollow eyes. Patients I couldn't save, patients whose eyes still haunted me when I closed mine. Their last words scribbled down in my own handwriting, fragmented, trembling sentences that no longer felt like science. I used to think medicine was a shield. But now, every diagnosis I'd ever written felt like an invitation. The more I stared, the more I saw a pattern emerging. Each patient had come to me after weeks of sleepless nights. Not the usual insomnia of a restless mind, something deeper, something that gnawed at the soul. They spoke of shadows at the edge of their vision, whispers that grew louder in silence, and a presence that seemed to follow them between dreams and waking. I remember how one woman described it. "It doesn't hurt me," she said, "it just waits." I had written that down too. But tonight, those words didn't feel like hers anymore. They felt like mine. A sudden flicker broke my thoughts. The lamp beside me blinked twice, then steadied. My breath caught in my throat. The air felt heavier, like invisible smoke pressing down on me. I could feel it again, that faint, deliberate presence, lingering just beyond the reach of light. I turned toward the window. Outside, the night was empty, but the reflection on the glass wasn't mine anymore. It looked like me, yes, but older, colder, and wrong. Its posture was still while mine trembled. Its eyes didn't blink. And then it smiled. That simple gesture cracked something inside me. My chair scraped backward as I stood, heart hammering. "No," I whispered to no one. "No, this isn't real." But the reflection tilted its head, as if listening. Its smile widened, slowly, patiently. The walls seemed to breathe. I could hear the faint hum of electricity faltering through the wires, like the house itself was reacting to my fear. My hands shook as I reached for the recorder on my desk. My rational mind screamed to run, but the doctor in me, the man who always needed to document, won. I pressed record. The red light blinked. My voice came out in a broken whisper. "If anyone ever hears this, don't look into the reflection. It looks back." And then the light went out. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat. Then, somewhere in that darkness, I heard the faint click of the recorder stopping. But I hadn't touched it. The morning never came. Or maybe it did, and I simply couldn't tell anymore. The curtains remained closed, the air inside heavy and unmoving. I had lost track of how long I had been sitting here, at my desk, surrounded by notes that no longer made sense, recordings that began and ended with static. The reflection hadn't returned since last night, but its absence didn't feel like safety. It felt like the silence before an operation, the pause between anesthesia and the first incision. I kept the recorder near me. It had become something like a companion, the only voice that still obeyed me. Every few hours, I pressed record and spoke, hoping the act of talking would tether me to reality. "I haven't seen it today," I said into the mic. "Maybe it's gone." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. My eyes drifted toward the mirror across the room. It had been covered with a sheet for days, but now I could see movement beneath the fabric. A slow ripple, as though something underneath was breathing. I rose from the chair, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air hummed softly, like a low vibration in the bones. I stood before the mirror, hand trembling, and pulled the sheet away. There I was, or something that used to be me. Its eyes were darker now, hollow pits that reflected no light. The corners of its mouth were torn into a permanent grin. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my chest. It lifted its hand slowly, mirroring mine. And then, it stopped halfway. Its fingers twitched. Mine didn't. That's when I understood, it wasn't reflecting me anymore. It was copying me. The world around me began to bend, the walls pulsing like veins, the air tasting like metal. The sound of static filled the room, growing louder, closer, until it was inside my ears. My hands covered them, but it didn't stop. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside me. I stumbled backward, knocking over the lamp. The light shattered, scattering shards across the floor. When I looked up, the mirror was empty. No reflection, nothing. Then I heard the click of the recorder again. It had turned on by itself. My voice came through the speaker, but I hadn't spoken. "If anyone finds this," it said, "tell them I tried to warn you." The static rose again, filling every corner of the room. And then, silence. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to Dr. Marlowe's story. If his words sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to leave a comment and tell me what you think. And if you'd like to hear more stories from the shadows, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's always another story waiting in the dark.